Okay, well, let's go ahead and begin then. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are at this time. And welcome to our webinar on Theologizing in an Age of COVID-19, Responsibility to the Most Vulnerable. I am Francisco Lozada, the Charles Fisher Catholic Professor of New Testament and Latinx Studies and the Director of the Borderlands Institute, funded by the Luce Foundation for Theological Education at Bright Divinity School. And with me serving as moderator today is Iracema Coronado, Professor of Director of the School of Transporter Studies at Arizona State University. Among us, we welcome all, as well as our panelists, Father Sean Carroll of the Society of Jesus, Executive Director of the Keno Border Initiative, Michelle Gonzalez Maldonado, Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Miami, and soon to be Dean of Arts and Science at the University of Scranton. Sarah Azaransky, Assistant Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York, and Santiago Piñon, Associate Professor of Religion at Texas Christian University. For the sake of time, allow me to begin with a brief introduction presenting the question at hand, followed by responses by the panelists in the order they are listed on the flyer. And as I mentioned, Iracema Coronado will moderate the discussion. Let us begin. There is no question that the current pandemic of COVID-19 reveals the ways in which our political, economic, and health policies continue to dehumanize migrants, low-income communities, and racialized minorities across all identity formations, such as Latinx and African Americans in our society. More and more stories are emerging where the most vulnerable and marginalized are disproportionately affected by the virus and dying at higher rates from COVID-19 compared to the general population. It is my position as a theologian that the root cause of our societies, especially the federal government's lack of concern for the care and well-being of migrants, women and children, the poor, the indigenous, and the racialized, marginalized in our society is theological. Given the xenophobic, anti-immigrant rhetoric toward migrants in particular, as well as the deeply layered structural racialization in housing, access to healthcare, and employment that have and continues to exist in this country, it is no wonder that these migrants and marginalized groups are experiencing sickness, trauma, and economic disparities. They have been and continue to be seen and treated as not worthy. As someone who is engaged in theological studies, we cannot fail the most vulnerable by waiting for a treatment of COVID-19. Rather, we must join the broader conversation with others on how we can responsibly speak to these disparities and the moral worth of the most vulnerable and marginalized, with the aim to educate and transform the conscience according to a spirit of life. In the tradition of liberation theology, responsibility is total self-understanding of the context. It is asking what are the vaccines administered by tradition and theologians. It is asking how to empower the marginalized in our communities, and is asking how do we evaluate, how do we educate about the most vulnerable. Responsibility is enabling the fullness of life expressed through the common moral good. It is time, I believe, for theologians, scholars to re-examine our principles as we look for ways to interrogate our ethical and theological values and our societal practices in the face of COVID-19 in such ways that bring theory in line with praxis. There is much more to say, of course, but I will leave it to my colleagues now to speak from their context. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Father Sean Carroll, Executive Director of the Keno Border Initiative, for his theological response. Father.
Thank you, Francisco, and really grateful for this opportunity to be with everyone virtually. And I work on the U.S.-Mexican border, Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, actually where Iracema is from. And we work with migrants in the areas of humanitarian assistance, education, research, and advocacy. And so I just want to begin by just describing a little bit of what we're seeing here. And one of those things is because it's important, I think, in terms of really, I think, my reflection in terms of a theological response, in particular to COVID-19. So for a number of weeks now, migrants have not been able to access the asylum process. These are people who have fled serious violence or threats of violence, particularly in the southern state of Guerrero, in Mexico, and really now are stuck on the border and really unsure what to do next, and really with uncertainty about whether they'll be able to access the process, and not to mention just their vulnerability to people involved in organized crime who prey on them and take advantage of them there. At the same time, one thing we're seeing is what are called expedited returns, where migrants crossing without documents, some fleeing violence, others seeking a more dignified way of life. They're captured by Border Patrol, they're sent directly back. The processing is like about 90 minutes, and they're sent to the nearest port of entry, which in this part of the world could be frequently not Nogales, but other ports of entry where there aren't institutions or structures available to provide care and support for them, and in fact where there are probably even higher incidences of higher presence of organized crime. And then another thing is migrants who have been sent back or sent to Mexico, whether they're from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Venezuela, to wait in Mexico for their court dates. And one thing we've been pushing back on a lot is this policy of forcing migrants to go to the port of entry where they were going to have their court date to get their new court date, because those court dates are being delayed. And for many here, that would be El Paso, Texas, a 12-hour ride, and just a real high degree of vulnerability. And obviously in this context of COVID-19, of becoming sick and not to mention just threats to violence and other threats that they would face. And so I think from here anyway, from where I stand in this context, I think thinking in the context of the theological tradition, I was just thinking about just some key concepts which I think are really important, and I think that are critical to hold up in response to the injustices that we're seeing and the vulnerabilities. And really one of those is just the concept of social sin. I mean, one definition of sin is a genuine failure in love of God and neighbor caused by perverse attachment to certain goods. And I think the particular prevalence of social sin, where that personal sin is institutionalized through policies and through institutions that leave migrants vulnerable, that prevent them from accessing safety, that prevent them from accessing the healthcare that they need to protect them from COVID-19, I think is an important concept to hold up. Also, just the importance of human dignity and just its deep roots, I think, in the theological tradition, and particularly rooted in Genesis, and that we're made in God's image and likeness, that gives us a certain dignity, and as well as certain rights and responsibilities. And I think of the many students and others who have come to our work here over the years, and that direct dialogue with migrants really humanizes the issue for them. And so I think that concept of human dignity and how do we humanize this issue so that we change these policies and structures that are causing so much injustice. I would hold up as well just the concept of the common good. This combination of social conditions and institutions that help human life thrive and flourish. And I think as all of us have seen, I think, at least in our current context, there's a very weak sense of the common good in the sense that it's just seen as being within one's national borders, and really trying to recapture that sense of the common good that touches our common humanity and speaks to that and connects us in that way. And so how can we hold up that concept more fully, and along with that, just this whole principle of solidarity, that the human person is my brother, is my sister, and at least here where we are on the border, particularly our brother and sister migrant, that we have a sense of responsibility for each other, and that goes hand in hand with a really robust sense of the common good that transcends borders. And so I think I mean, these are just four kind of principles or concepts that I want to mention I think are particularly important here on the border in our work with migrants, but I think really as well is how can we speak to these concepts and develop them in a very robust way to speak to this particular reality of COVID-19 and appropriate responses and just responses to this reality. And so naming those structures and institutions and policies that are sinful, that are contrary to God's goodness, that respect for human dignity, which means healthcare, access to healthcare for all, not just for certain people, and not excluding migrants or homeless or other vulnerable people. A more robust sense of the common good, as I've mentioned, that transcends borders, and also a robust sense of solidarity, where we're literally transcending and crossing borders in order to pool resources, to pool knowledge and all that's needed in order to respond to this very challenging and difficult reality. I'm a Jesuit. Our Spirit General's Father Arturo Sosa, and he gave a 1 hour webinar or talk to Jesuits the other day on COVID-19, and I really liked what he said about it. And what he said is this: he says the worst virus is not COVID-19, but the injustice that does not let so very many people live a dignified human life. And I think that just captures really well, and I think really helps our focus in terms of theological reflection and response to this reality. And he went on to say that we want to live this time as an opportunity. And so I think the theological tradition can help us do that, to live this time as an opportunity by holding up and speaking to these important theological concepts of social sin, of human dignity, of a common good, and of solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. Let's turn it over to Michelle Gonzalez Maldonado, Professor of Religious Studies at University of Miami.
Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and I really want to thank Francisco and Iracema for the invitation to participate in this very important conversation. And I'm extremely grateful to be a part of this panel with these esteemed colleagues. I want to begin with 3 disclaimers. Mm-hmm. First of all, this is an entirely unnatural, I mean, it is for all of us, but form of social engagement for me. I don't even like speaking to people on the phone. For me, I'm not on Facebook. I hate texting. I have not done a Zoom happy hour yet. In a sense, I would say I'm very sacramental in my social interactions, because I really kind of crave the flesh and the face and the person in front of me. That awkwardness aside, my second disclaimer is that while I was thrilled that Francisco asked me to participate in this session, that exhilaration turned to slight dismay when he asked me to speak as a theologian. Not that I have anything against theologians, because I am one. However, it is my experience that we are not the best type of people to address these life-pressing matters as we live them. We are not in-the-moment thinkers. We tend to live through the moment, Then we go read a bunch of other theologians that help us process that experience. And we weigh that in light of scripture and tradition. And then we theologize, right? It's often very much after. And the world we're living in today has provided some of us with the luxury of time, yet simultaneously a sense of urgency as we are surrounded by illness, death, and injustice. And this leads to my third and last disclaimer, which is really that I sit in front of you today filled with anxiety and despair and utter sadness at what is happening in our world. I don't sleep well at night. You know, I watch the news and read the news incessantly. Preparing for today has been the most substantial intellectual exercise I have been able to do in weeks. And I get mad at myself for worrying about things when I am blessed that me and my husband and my kids are healthy and we're safe. And so I spend a lot of days feeling really kind of utterly helpless in the face of the enormity of what we're living through. But we cannot allow that helplessness, right, to define us. So, you know, theology in many ways is a second step. And as defined by the great Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez, theology is critical reflection on Christian practice in light of the word, right? So the theology comes after. We look at the world around us and we try to make sense of it in light of and through the everyday beliefs and practices of Christians across the globe. For me, I have always seen my role as theologian as that of a storyteller. And as a Christian theologian, I have felt that the stories of those in the underside of history have to be front and center. You know, I'm the daughter of immigrants, or to be precise, political refugees that left Cuba in 1960 after Fidel Castro's revolution. And my parents really raised me with a love of Cuba, but also a deep love and respect for the United States. I mean, my parents were the literal immigrant American dream. And they constantly reminded me and my brother of the opportunities and freedoms we have here in the US, things that we should never take for granted. However, I also know that part of why my parents were immigrant poster children is the political refugee status they were given, their white skin, and their professional backgrounds. The US is no longer a safe country for immigrants. I never thought I would have to explain to my sons about the vilification of us and assure them that not everyone thinks that they're going to grow up to be criminals, drug dealers, and rapists. I never thought we were moving towards a country that resembles the country that welcomed my parents less and less. We also must speak of the illegalization and criminalization of Latinos and Latinas that understands us and our culture as a threat to the United States. And don't get me, you know, even into the dynamic, you know, my husband is Guatemalan, and actually my older son was born in Guatemala, of looking at the dynamics of COVID-19 now being, you know, traveling south of the border from the United States through the deportation of men and women back to countries in Central America. Now, I've always understood myself as an academic theologian, not an ecclesial one. And what I mean by that is that I've always focused on how theology could better serve higher education. And really in my heart, I've always said I am a teacher, right? And so when I think about the university today, I'm very informed by the words of the Jesuit Ignacio Ellacuría, who wrote, "The university should take flesh intellectually among the poor, to be the knowledge of the voiceless, and intellectual support for those who have truth and righteousness in their own reality, even when it has been stolen from them, but do not have the academic reasons needed to justify and legitimate their truth and rightness." End of the quote. So for me, bringing the voices of the marginalized into the center of academic discourse as creators and agents of truth is fundamental to theology. We who have the privilege of a voice in these arenas must use that privilege to create spaces for other voices, and more importantly, challenge our definitions of who really are authentic sources of knowledge. You know, I've thought a lot about the word essential in the past few weeks, right? Prior to COVID-19, no one would ever have denied that a doctor, a police officer, a firefighter, or a healthcare worker was essential. But now people who are deemed essential just 2 months ago were the faceless brown and Black people who clean our buildings, stock our grocery shelves, process our food and plants, and pick agriculture from the earth. They are dying in disproportionate rates. And the only reason they are deemed essential is because we need them for our economy and our very survival. Their lives do not have intrinsic value, and suddenly the non-person has become the essential worker. And here I think of that fantastic poem by Eduardo Galeano called Nobodies, where he describes the nobodies as those people who are not human beings, but human resources, but who do not have faces, but arms, who do not have names, but numbers. And so I just want to conclude by saying, you know, I think it's the responsibility of the theologian to ensure that we don't forget this moment and the people who are suffering in silence and alone. The theologian Johannes Metz wrote many years ago about the dangerous memory of the passion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. This dangerous memory is a call to solidarity and action in order to transform oppressive structures. Dangerous remembering is a practice. This remembering is dangerous because it privileges the truth of those who have suffered. And it is subversive because it allows the memories of the marginalized to be acknowledged and accepted as truth. If there's one thing we theologians can do, it is to connect this dangerous memory to our shared history and intellectual tradition. You know, people keep talking about how things will be different, right? When we open up, you know, how we're gonna have to act differently. Thinking about schools, churches, sporting events. But I also hope we start talking about how we're going to be different ontologically after all of this, reminded of the fragility and interconnectedness of our humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle. And let me a word of apology. I figure out how to mute individual folks here. So it's technology. I'm learning Zoom little by little. So it's but I think we're able to block out the background noise there. So thank you. Our next speaker is Sarah Azaransky, Assistant Professor of Social Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be with you. I'm very grateful to be part of this webinar, and I'll start by admitting, and I wrote this to Francisco when he invited me, that I don't know what a competent or coherent reaction to this situation is. And I'm gonna hold on to that knowing as being properly intellectually and spiritually modest. But I can share what I do and what I hope are our values and how these can guide us, especially as it means, as we've already heard, centering the lives and complex realities of immigrant and refugee communities. I am a social ethicist, which means, as I write up on the board, because it's a short definition to my students, that I investigate the social, economic, and political relations of power with the goal of transforming the social order toward justice. In short, I try to analyze and ask what's going on here, and then think about the ways, given what's happening, try to imagine what more just relations would look like, how we can organize our social and political lives so that there's more flourishing for more people. As Francisco noted, I teach at Union in New York City, and faculty who teach at Union live at Union. So I live and work in Upper Manhattan. And so as an initial foray into analyzing what's happening, the first step of social ethics, I want to witness from my vantage point in New York a few of the realities of the pandemic. The first is to lift up the memory of those who have died. As of yesterday, according to the city's Department of Health, 11,477 people have died in New York City as a result of COVID-19. And just about 2 weeks ago, I started to receive a new kind of email, one that announced the death of someone in our extended networks in my family's communities. And so among these, I want to note two people. One was a coach in my daughter's soccer club who died. His name was Freddy Fuentes, and he was grew up in Guayaquil, Ecuador, where he played professional soccer. He came to New York to play soccer and to coach. And he loved the game, and his players loved him, I can attest. He was 50 years old, and he died last week, and he left behind a wife and 3 sons. We also got the news that an English teacher at my son's high school died. Her name was Kimberly Nguyen, and she was 33 years old. She taught at the Brooklyn Latin School, which is a public high school where a significant number of students come from immigrant families, which tends to be the case all over New York and was particularly the case in this school. Miss Nguyen herself was a first-generation American, a child of refugees from Cambodia as a result of US war in Indochina. And she was also a writer. And this past week, I've been reading some of her work, and I was caught up short by something that she wrote about a mentorship program that she was part of and what mentorship from other Asian American writers meant to her. And it gave her, she wrote, the belief that things can be different. Now, both Ms. Nguyen and Coach Fuentes were part of our city's larger immigrant and refugee communities. And if New York has been the epicenter of the virus, our immigrant communities in the city has been, in the New York Times has said, the epicenter of the epicenter. So there's absolutely work to be done to analyze the intersecting structures that make some people more vulnerable to illness and death. And so this is to paraphrase Ruthie Gilmore's definition of racism. And I know here in New York, when it's just sirens all the time, it's hard to imagine how grief is working its way through the city, but also how we will continue to grieve in the coming months when finally there aren't so many people in the hospital. And so I think part of what this grief is going to have to mean is addressing the conditions that make some people much more likely to die. And so in doing so, I think we'll honor Ms. Nguyen's belief that things can be different, and hopefully we'll work to make it so. And so certainly as the virus has torn through the city, state power has continued to target immigrant and refugees here in New York as well as around the country. The week before the city was shuttered, so just about 6 weeks ago, one of my classes visited immigration court in downtown Manhattan. And there we witnessed, among the number of people appearing in court, a number of children who were called before judges. One was a family, a 12-year-old girl and her brother. Her brother was 2, and the 12-year-old was looking after the 2-year-old, trying to keep them quiet, while the judge told their mother what documents she needed from her daughter's school. And as now all the schools are closed, I'm trying to imagine how people are getting the documentation they need from the schools. And the judge explained to the woman, to the mom, that she needed to find a lawyer for her kids. The judge told the woman it wasn't a good idea for her to serve as counsel for her kids. And the woman, the mother, explained that she had called the numbers of the pro bono help that she'd been given, but that they all had long lines and no lawyers were available. So I just want to note that federal immigration courts in New York City were, if not the last, among the last large gathering places in the city to be closed. And people needed to attend the hearings. If they didn't show up, they would most likely be issued a removal order. And so as we think about immigration courts in New York that were open, it's certainly the case that here in New York and in northern New Jersey and all around the country, there are tens of thousands of people in immigration detention. And in fact, ICE increased the number of people it was detaining into mid-March, even when the risk of the virus was clear. And so certainly, I'm sure this is true in all of your localities. Here we have very good reporting on our public radio station in New York and New Jersey, which in the past year before the virus has really been emphasizing how people who are detained get very little to no medical care. And that substandard medical care has been that much more of an issue in the midst of COVID. And last week, if you haven't heard, there's a fantastic report from Latino USA, excellent and damning report about the lack of medical care in response to COVID in immigration detention centers around the country. And what's fantastic about kind of both sets of reporting is how they really center the voices of people who are detained, who have a fantastic and sharp analysis of what's going on and what they need. Okay, so as I sort of come up against the end of my allotted time, I want to earn my keep as an ethicist and give us a handful of principles to think with, as Father Carroll did, and as Dr. Maldonado did. So, I want to say relational justice and echo common good. I want us to have a robust account of moral agency in the midst of structural sin. But honestly, I feel like I don't want to profess too much right now. I don't feel ready to assort. I don't know what the right norms and principles are. But maybe this one, and that is, I think, what we're already doing, but just to affirm its value. And that is to encourage us to listen so that we can continue to foster an ethical vision that prioritizes the moral knowledge of those people who know more about how the pandemic is exacerbating injustice, those who are experiencing themselves and who are surviving it. And so here I'm too, in particular, referring to ethicist Tracy West's conviction on how focusing on the particular is a vehicle to gain insight to the universal or common well-being. And those particularities, those stories matter, and certainly can be part of our grieving process, but also can be part of affirming life going forward in the next 1, 2, 3, 5 years. And certainly we can do this in part by listening and learning from immigrant and worker-led movements. So some that are active in New York, National Domestic Workers Alliance, Movimiento Conseca, who's particularly focused on undocumented families, Make the Road New York, Make the Road New Jersey. And of course, there's gonna be stories we won't hear. And our listening needs to mark this silence. And it's my hope and belief that listening carefully now and in the coming months can really help us to do the work we've all been talking about so far, which is to shift our imagination. So shift our imagination of what we can do and of who we can be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Our last panelist today is Santiago Piñon, professor of religious studies at Texas Christian University. Santiago.
Thank you again, just like everyone else that was speaking ahead of me, Francisco and Iracema, thank you for organizing this, and to all the participants here, thank you for joining us. When Francisco first asked me to do this, my initial reaction was no. I didn't want to do that. Just because, and it's not because I don't like Francisco, I love him to death, he's a colleague and a friend. It's not because I don't think that the topic is important. The reason my initial reaction was no is because I'm home with my wife, which I like. It's that she's not the problem, but we're also home with our kids. That's the problem, and we have 7-year-old triplets. So at any moment they could bust through the door and just do. So if that happens, just be patient. But it also means that my university, TCU, just like probably many of you, have gone remotely. And so all of our courses, we had to turn them online. We had to meet with students online and all of those normal things, which of course means that time management is almost non-existent. I barely have enough time to drink at night, but we still try to do that at night. So when Francisco asked me to do this, I'm like, what do I do? He's like, focus on teaching and theologizing during this time. So among our community, we often talk about public theology and political theology and being moving beyond our community, because we like to talk to one another about how do we really impact people outside of our community? How do we help people who are not part of the academia? And so one thing that I did 2.5 weeks ago is that I wrote a letter to the city council. And this is what I want to do, look at, is just go through the letter. That I'm not going to read it to you, but kind of the elements there. So my focus was not necessarily on immigrants, but I focused on, when he said on the most vulnerable, what I did is I focused on children with special needs or people with special needs. And I did that because we have 4 children and all 4 of our children are special needs kids. This time is really scary for us because a simple cold for our children can put them in the hospital for 2 to 3 weeks. And so we are really concerned. We take care. We had caretakers come into our house and we told them to stop. When I go out and I come back in to buy essential groceries, I take my clothes off in the garage. I spray my shoes with Clorox with bleach and water. I spray all the bags and the grocery items, and then I go straight to the shower. I take a shower. I come out, and then I hug my kids and my wife sometimes, but mostly my kids. That was a joke. Okay, so anyway. So the letter that I wrote to the mayor, rather than thinking about, well, how do we theologize? What does that mean? I thought about, well, I'm actually going to try to do it, right? And so I wrote a letter to the mayor and to the city council, which I sent through email to them directly. I posted on the city website, and I posted on a couple of the local community social medias, Facebook and Nextdoor and things of that nature. And I got reactions, both positive and negative, and I'll share some of those here. But I'll just share the first paragraph, and then I'll go through the outline, and hopefully this will serve as an example of something that we can do, right or wrong, just something. I'm writing this letter as a special plea to our local elected officials to be proactive in the midst of the current global pandemic that affects all of us, regardless of race, creed, and socioeconomic status. COVID-19 has affected many communities, sometimes with catastrophic consequences. Many who believe that the novel virus was a hoax blown out of proportions by the social media are suddenly backpedaling over their non-response to the virus. Recently, the Star Telegram, that's our local newspaper, reported on April 3rd, 2020, that the mayor of San Antonio stated a wake-up call about the seriousness of COVID-19 to our community. Unfortunately, this realization didn't come until 80% of the residents and some of the caretakers from a local nursing home, Southeast Nursing and Rehabilitation Center, had been infected by the coronavirus. To be certain, global pandemics have always been part of the human condition. And so what I do in the next paragraph is I give a brief history of the 14th century Black Death and what took place there. I noted specifically that it was the doctors and the caretakers, along with the clergy, who were taking care of the sick, who oftentimes died before those people who they were taking care of. And then I highlight the fact that we have our own caretakers who are putting themselves at risk, not only themselves, but also their families at risk because they come home and are around those individuals. I then go and I talk about some of the local grocery stores in our community that are not practicing social distancing, that are not enforcing anything, and I ask them to kind of start doing some of those things. And as I mentioned, rather than just talking about politics and policies, I kind of try to model what some of that expected actions that I wanted. And so I just like I shared with you, I shared those things of coming home, taking shoes off, etc. When we go out, we put on a mask. Even if it's just a homemade mask, we put something on. And then I go to the next paragraph. This is the one that really got me in trouble because I mentioned that during the 14th century, that there was a group of religious zealots who believed that it was God who was the cause of this plague. And they called for public gatherings and for confessions, and oftentimes, what do you call it? they would flagellate themselves, right? And so and when the plague that wasn't subdued, they then turned their attentions to the Jews in the community and started and would even burn down an entire house, a wooden house with Jewish people inside, and using them as a scapegoat. And so then I asked the city council to please call all the religious organizations in the community and ask them to abide by the CDC guidelines as well, and meaning not to have social gatherings of more than 10 people. And of course, that didn't go well. I then just go on a little bit more, and I tell the city council, because we hadn't had any COVID cases yet, at the time that I wrote, we now have some. And so this was 2.5 weeks ago. I said, we've been blessed so far that we haven't had any, but we can't assume that we won't. And so we must do something and act. So in my focus of theologizing within the pandemic of COVID-19, I took the route of how do we address the public? Right? How do we look to them? And so I try to bring theology and politics and the pandemics together. And while I may not have mentioned God specifically, the theology was there in the background the whole time. And partly I did that because I didn't want to come across as some just religious fanatic. I also didn't want to, many of the people in the community know that I teach at TCU in the religion department, that I'm an ethicist and a theologian, and so I didn't want to necessarily focus on that too much. So I want to leave more time for all of us to answer questions, and so thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Erasema, do you want to?
Yes, well, I want to thank the panelists for your inspiring words, for the challenges that you present to all of us. And I'm hoping that we have a lot of participation from the audience. So if you can raise your hand and I can call on you, or if you want to chat and send your question, that also will work. And I'm sorry about the echo. And we have 47 participants.
Very good.
So we'll give you a few more minutes to gather your thoughts. Okay, Neil, please unmute yourself.
Hi there. Thank you very much, all of you, for organizing this and for your comments. I'm very grateful for this. I have been impressed from the beginning with Francisco's way of framing this as a theological problem, and all of your comments about the theological resources to bring to this. I'm impressed also that this is not just a matter of a lack of theological value around us. As Francisco was first speaking, I grabbed off my shelf Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine, where she talks about what she calls the theology of neoliberalism, which has a very specific doctrine of creation where what exists must be obliterated so it can be converted to what is profitable. And I think we're seeing that on a moment-by-moment basis in this crisis as all sorts of resources are destroyed and things like the pandemic office disappear. And resources are marshaled to make sure that the wealthy stay as wealthy as possible and are protected. It's astonishing. And I think it helps us as theologians, the question several of you have brought up, what do theologians bring to this? We have analytic capabilities. We have ways of thinking about mythology and theologies that are alternative to the Christian tradition, even as they have infected the Christian tradition. So I think part of what we can do is to name those analyses often and make a pattern of it, just to say up front, we as church recognize the anti-theology at work around us. I think we hold back from that because it seems like we're going political, and we have all been carefully trained not to speak politically if we're theologians. But I think that's a risk we have to get over.
Thank you, Neil. Anyone else?
It's the chat.
Okay, Henry. Okay, Henry, would you like to read your question? Okay, I'll go ahead and read it. How do we empower the marginalized to speak about their lived experiences during this time, but especially after this time? I am concerned that people of privilege will be inclined to monopolize discourse on the meaning-making of this period. Even people of privilege with an academic theology. My speakers are not working, sorry. So who would like to answer that?
I think one way is, I mean, it may sound obvious, but I think it's been helpful to us is through social media. We partnered with the Ignatian Solidarity Network on updates from the border. And part of the most recent update was, and if you're familiar with Facebook Live, it's like a live broadcast from where you are. And being in Nogales, Sonora, across the border, to be able to actually interview a migrant who talked about his experience. And then obviously if that transmission, I mean, is shared, then that reaches a significant number of people. And I think we've had, I mean, not so much a COVID-19, but more in general, lifting up migrant voices, using the media in a good way. You know, whether it's radio, whether it's video, we've just seen over time that's been a powerful way to lift up their voices, which we've tried to do as much as possible when we have media visits. So I just mentioned those as a couple of practical ways to lift up their voices and in the midst of this pandemic.
Let's see.
Questions?
So I appreciate the speakers who have really addressed the core of theologizing around COVID-19. But as someone who's also engaging in classroom teaching around the regular subjects that I was assigned to teach before the pandemic took root in our communities, I'm curious if you have any thoughts or suggestions around how to not only incorporate but balance theologizing specifically around COVID-19, but also theologizing about anything. So teaching our regular subjects during this time of COVID-19.
I'll jump in. I think so I have to admit I'm on research leave, so I unfortunately do not have that problem this semester, but it's something I thought a lot about, especially because my husband also works for the University of Miami, and he actually works with the division that is in charge of helping faculty transition all their courses online, and looking at different types of pedagogical strategies. And sort of, for me, the hardest thing in the world has always been to walk into class and teach what's on the syllabus when something traumatic has happened in the world, right? And it's every day now, right? So it's not like, oh, this event happened, we had class on Tuesday and this horrible thing happened on Wednesday, so let's talk about it on Thursday and move on, right? This is something that we're living and breathing in very different ways. And we also have to admit that there's also a lot of ignorance out there about how dire the situation is, right? And really the amount of human suffering. And I think a lot of, too, sort of the collective suffering and sort of collective aftermath of this, right? Sort of how are we going to emerge from this? And so for me, you know, I really feel sort of, I don't know what I would do, you know, like really, I think if I was teaching now, I think I would try to find a balance of trying, you know, I always tell my students that, that they cannot understand the world around them if they don't understand religion. And so that, sadly, for better or worse, we're seeing some really compassionate theology emerging from this, from ecclesial leaders, from academics, through social media, through different podcasts. But we're also seeing some awful theology emerge from this too. I mean, which is just gut-wrenching, right? So I think probably what I would be doing is playing a little bit with that, kind of saying, okay, let's look at the different ways and hear from a Christian perspective how Christians are interpreting this, right? And look at, because there, it doesn't matter if it's COVID-19 or the Eucharist, you know, throughout the history of Christianity, churches and theologians have shared these common symbols, these common themes, and interpreted them in vastly different ways, right? And looked at different life experiences in the history of Christianity, interpreted in vastly different ways. So I think that's one way I would do it, is kind of looking at sort of the diversity and complexity of, and frankly, the awfulness of some of the theology that is directly a result of this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I may chime in along with Michelle here, in response to Amy's question with regard to teaching, I you know, part of initiating some of this discussion here was you know, emanates out of the classroom a little bit for me as well. You know, I'm teaching Intro to New Testament this semester. We just got done talking about Corinthians. And one of the major themes in Corinthians is the question of body. And body is it's everywhere. The image, the ideas, wrestling with these concepts. And these are concepts that I want my students to understand, or at least wrestle with a bit. At the same time, you know, I was in, I'm dating myself here. I was in high school as well as undergrad at a Jesuit school at some years ago in the 80s. And I always felt, and someone could correct me here, but I always felt theologians were late to the discussion on AIDS. And it didn't appear until a lot later for a variety of reasons, of course. And I don't know if theologians or cultural critics of theology or whatever, part of my thinking here is that we can't wait. And we have to begin the process. How messy it might be in the beginning, I don't want to be late to this game again, in some sense. And so that's part of the impetus here, is really to initiate, to start, to get people thinking, and to participate. Many of us are engaged with the political science field, as well as economists and whatnot. And what's missing in their conversations at times is that they see people as numbers, stats. And I want them to go a little deeper, to see some humanity behind them. They're seen in the abstract. And this is where I thought, Sarah's, your point with giving the stories were so important. Hearing, you know, centering these folks who have passed away because of their stories changed the narrative in many ways, and they're powerful narratives. And so it's to me, I guess I'm getting maybe older. I just don't want to be waiting to hear how they theologize us, as well as we start engaging in some ways, but also empowering folks. I teach at divinity school. Many of my students are go into various congregations as well as social work and whatnot. But you know, my role as a teacher I also feel some responsibility in championing the voice. And I think, as Michelle and Sarah and Santiago pointed out, to give these folks, as well as Father Sean, give these folks agency. And trying to wrestle with that. How will I do that? And so I wanted to try to get some of that in before before the end of the semester and before we go into the summer and whatnot, and but to initiate some of that theological reflection there. So, but I do agree with Neil's point that I do think we do have those analytical ways of thinking that that are important, and to hone in on those skills a bit more. I think it would be really interesting as a project to go back to 1918 and see what was happening among theologians and biblical scholars and other fields, other people around that field. What was going on then? Was there a discussion? Was there not a discussion? And someone who teaches a little bit about history of hermeneutics, it's hard to understand that history without understanding the impact of World War I, for example, in the US and other global events at the time. So I wonder, I wouldn't want to be, 20 years, 30 years down the road and folks are saying, what did the theologians do back then? And so that was part of my thinking behind some of this. So anyway, Irasema? Oh, you have to unmute yourself. Can we hear you? They're almost there.
Hear me?
Yes, okay.
Okay, so a comment from Kamala Platt. Yesterday, I heard a webinar from Global Development Policy Center of International Economists about COVID-19 influences. Speakers advocated a global Green New Deal with many of the concerns you raise, an emphasis on creating sustainable climate justice, centering countries and peoples most vulnerable and least responsible for injustices. Would like to know thoughts about globalizing, theologizing of the pandemic. Let me go ahead and just wrap this up because there are several and I want to make sure everyone has an opportunity. From Neil to everyone, ask students week by week to make connections between course material and real life. Ask how is religion being presented. In fall 2016, I taught Hebrew Bible and was able every week to bring in the Bible in the presidential campaign and ask students to evaluate wrong use of Bible. From Cyrus, the film Seventh Seal is challenging to watch in the midst of the pandemic, but it deals with the plague and the doubts of a knight returning from the Crusades. Perhaps it addresses something of what Santiago was saying. Bernardo Segovia's SBL presidential address spoke to rain questions at different decades of biblical scholarship, long stretches of ignoring the real world. Crystal, building on Francisco's reflections on the body, I'm wondering particularly about breath. This virus is one that literally takes people's breath away. And breath is such an important theological category as it relates to the body and spirit. From Cyrus, apparently Israeli nurses still use breath for the main determination of death. So those are all the comments, and maybe we're at time, but maybe we can have all of our speakers give one last final comment, or maybe address some of the questions and some of the comments that I read out, and then we can wrap it up, because we did say this would end in an hour, and we want to make sure we're respectful of people's times. So maybe Michelle, do you have a few parting words?
I just want to resonate. I resonate with Crystal's comment about breath. I mean, that's something I've really been thinking about, in particular in light of Genesis 2. And then also for me, I heard, I think it was sometime recently, Bart Ehrman was talking about his new book on NPR's Fresh Air. And he was talking about how in ancient Judaism that sort of this body-soul dualism is not part of the worldview that Jesus lived in, right? And that's something really that Christians kind of imposed into his theology, because for ancient Judaism it was about breath and creation, and really breath and life and the interconnection. Now, I have not read his book, but it really got me, so your question really got me thinking about that interview, because I do think there's a very deep theological avenue to look at breath and how it connects to our creation and how it connects to the concreteness of the virus and the human suffering surrounding the virus. So thank you all.
Thank you, Michelle. Sarah.
Yeah, I very much appreciate everybody being so astute and sharp. I'm really impressed. I feel very dull. But one of the things that, Amy, your question got me thinking of, I teach at a seminary, so many of my students are grown-ups and like me have kids, or they're going to other parts of the country right now. And one of the things I said to my students, which is what I say in class in any event, is that ethics is done in community. And now more than ever, part of the work of our work together is to keep each other healthy and well. I'm not in pastoral theology, but my colleagues in pastoral theology talk about the significance of being a non-anxious presence, which is hard right now. And so I would just want to say that I'm grateful for Francisco and Iracema for bringing us together, but also to recognize that it's important that we continue to do this work, even if we need, like me, to be dragged a little bit to it. And that this is part of the work of ethics, is being in community like this and bouncing ideas off each other. And I'm very grateful for that. So thank you. And I hope everyone's well and continues to be well.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
And now Santiago.
Yeah, I was the question about students and how that Amy asked. So I was teaching this semester. I am teaching this semester. Unfortunately, I was teaching an overload, and so we have a 3-2 teaching load, and this was my 3 semester, which means I'm teaching 4 courses with the overload. And so I didn't know this was going to happen, or I also would have done the 2. But anyway. I didn't change anything in my courses. I kept them the same. I presented my courses in terms of the online, some sense of normalcy. The reason I wanted to do that is to help students, because they're anxious, they're scared, they're worried, to just give students some, again, trying to model some sense of not being anxious, of not being worried. Yes, I'm concerned. I worry about my kids and those, but also we try to maintain some kind of normalcy. Also, I know that at the end, when my students graduate, they're not going to remember my lectures. They're not going to remember my PowerPoint presentations. They're not going to remember, maybe they'll remember the grades, but they're not going to remember any of that. They will remember the compassion that I show them. And the understanding. And for me, that's what's really important, because I'm not just in this to teach students, I'm in this to really form and shape character. For me, that's what ethics is. And so if they can leave this place, TCU, just a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more kind, I feel like I actually did something to contribute to their education.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Father Sean.
Yeah, so just want to pick up just on the comment that Kamala made about wanting to know how to globalize the theologizing about the pandemic, and I think that's a great question. You know, just how to broaden the reflection and the input and particularly maybe from not even but also with theologians from outside the United States, and I know that in our experience here on the border, I think a key part of what we've done here and on the issue of migration is humanizing the issue. It's that direct contact, that really leads to deeper reflection and action. And so I would see that globalization of theologizing on the pandemic going really hand in hand with, as Sarah was saying, just the voices and the stories of those most affected by it, both in the U.S. and outside the U.S. as well. And so I think broadening that reflection can be really important because it will really enrich it, and I think deepen theology's response to the pandemic, to this reality.
Okay.
Thank you, Father Sean. Well, before I turn it over to Francisco for his final comments, I want to thank everyone for participating. Thank you for your intellectual, I'm just really impressed with the capacity of everyone to bring this together, and your intellectual prowess is really valued at this time. Keep up the good work, and thank you for your kind and compassionate words and for being so willing to participate. And let's hope that we can do this again. This will be available on video or a recording, and we'll send it to everyone so you can disseminate it to people that were unable to join us. And thank you from the bottom of my heart for your time today.
Yes, and likewise, thank you for accepting the invitation. I've got a chance to meet Father Sean this past January, and of course I've read Michelle's work as well as Sarah's work on the borderlands, and my colleague Santiago. So the invite was generated by a high respect for your work, whether it's on the ground or in the mine or whatever. So again, thank you for accepting the invitation and getting this conversation started. So thank you.
Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.